In his book, The Papa Prayer, Larry Crabb articulates a common Christian desire to hear from God. What I want is to have a real conversation with God, where I experience Him and hear His voice and feel His strength. I want so badly to feel like I'm talking to God and He's talking to me, like two friends enjoying each other and not me just trotting out my well-worn list or pouring out my heart into the silence. In the book Hearing God that we're studying now, Dallas Willard argues that it is not necessarily that the Christian experience of prayer and experiencing God speaking to them in this way is lacking. Rather, it's that they don't understand the language or even how the experience works that gets in the way. One of the problems is that we tend to see our relationship with God as an arrangement between Jesus and the Father, instead of the personal connection that it's supposed to be. And so we live in a paradox. On the one hand, we look into Scripture and we have the massive testimony to the widespread faith in God's personal guiding communication with us, far more than providential and blindly controlling guidance. We see this in the way that God spoke with Noah, Moses, the prophets, and especially Jesus himself. On the other hand, we also find a pervasive and often painful uncertainty about how hearing God's voice actually works today and what its place is in the church and in the personal Christian life. The paradox about hearing God's voice is only resolved and removed by developing a clear understanding and a confident practical orientation towards God's way of guiding us and communicating with us. The beginning steps in understanding God's language and how a relationship with God in prayer works begins with knowing who God is, knowing what kinds of beings we are, and knowing what the relationship should be like. Our failure to hear God has its deepest roots in our failure to understand, accept, and grow into this conversational relationship with God. The sort of relationship suited to friends who are mature persons in a shared enterprise. Developing this depends on our accepting, firstly, that the relationship must be rooted in a conviction that our Father's intent is to form our character instead of giving us direction. When we receive guidance, then, it is aimed at developing in us a character capable of making right decisions on our own. And this is the same for the Father's direction to the church. Secondly, we take the power from this conversational relationship when we approach it with the wrong motives. An example of wrong motives is when we seek to hear from our Father as a way of securing our own safety, comfort, and righteousness. One of Jesus' most powerful prayers in the Garden of Gethsemane ended with the plea, "Not my will, but yours be done." It was not the Father who offered Jesus safety and security, but Satan during his temptations. For Jesus, closeness with the Father and obedience to his guidance took him through the cross. Now, we do well to recognize that our Father's will for us is for us to be conformed to his Son, and often that leads us through to our own cross. Finally, it's important that our Father speaks to his people in many forms. A survey of the Bible indicates that any number of forms that he uses to communicate with his people. The form will be different depending on the type of person hearing. Artists are going to hear from God in a way that is different from farmers. This variation is part of the diversity of human nature. But what is the same, and this is the key, is that it is the same spirit behind the communication. This means that while the method differs, and God may speak to us through various circumstances, through people, through situations, through Scripture, the same Spirit is there, and we need to develop a sensitivity to that Spirit so that we can see the thread of God speaking to us. The best way then to do this is to test the Spirit by sharing anything that we feel that God has spoken to us with other believers who have a history and experience in hearing from the Father themselves. They are able to help us test and know if what we have heard is good and true and from the Father. So those three things again. The first is coming to an understanding of God, that He is a loving Father who desires to move us into maturity. But in order for Him to do that, His communication with us is geared towards our transformation and not necessarily our safety and security. And thirdly, then, that hearing from God is in that same spirit that others will have heard from God. And so we test whether what we are hearing from God, whether what is moving us towards transformation, whether that guidance that we are hearing comes from the Father, by asking other believers to test that spirit with us. Now, this last week, you were asked to be mindful of your feelings and desires when you approach God in prayer. You were also to ask Him how He wants you to see Him. Now, remembering that our relationship with Him, our Father, is aimed at our transformation, I want you to continue both of these practices for the next week. Intentionally prepare your heart with the idea that in prayer, your Father will point out what He wants you to know and what He wants you to do in order for you to be transformed into someone more like His Son, into someone who can hear His Spirit more clearly. And this might not involve your safety and security. Because remember that the abundance of life that Jesus desires for us comes in a promise. I have come to give you life and life to the full. But as we seek Him, that life may come out of difficult circumstances. I'll see you in a week.